All right, welcome back to PacWest Bigfoot. This is David, and first and foremost, Happy New Year to you, and I hope and pray that you guys have a wonderful, wonderful New Year this year and are truly blessed through it. Real quick, if you want to, you can get over to PacWestBigfoot.com, PacWestBigfoot.com. You can grab yourself a hoodie or a t-shirt or a cool coffee mug. If you have not yet, and I will be announcing the winner next week, I like to give a little something free from there away every single month, and you can go over to PacWestBigfoot.com and sign up to the clan and enter for your chance to win every single month. Here's the other thing real quick. On the PacWest Bigfoot Facebook page, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing a little bit of the BFRO accounts out there, some of the updated and latest information that they have, as well as some other information from good friends of mine like William Jevning out here, my friends over at Monster X Radio. I want to share some of that out there as well. I know that these are based on true Bigfoot encounters and everything, but sometimes, you really want to get in there and see some of this and listen to some of this, some of these recent reports and everything. So I wanted to share that with you. Other than that, let's get going with this week's PacWest Bigfoot encounter story from the beautiful Pacific Northwest. 2 cross-country skiers watch Bigfoot kill a deer near Kitson Springs. Clear my throat. Scary. That is what it's like to see a Bigfoot kill a deer, especially when you were out there in the wild and knowing you're possibly on the menu of one of these things as well. This all happened near Kitson Springs in Oregon not 7 years ago, barely. We were out doing some cross-country skiing, well, what my husband and I call cross-country skiing, that is. Here's what happened and what was one of the most memorable winters and trips for us ever. Bigfoot kill a deer right in front of us. We were brand new to cross-country skiing nearly 7 years ago. It was our second trip out to this particular when this particular event happened and changed our lives, and for good in some ways. Recently, about 7 years ago to be exact, my husband and I both retired, me 6 months before him, but still we retired in the same year. My husband was a state police officer in California, and I was a nurse in the Bay Area. We retired, packed up, and left for the state of Oregon. We'd visited Oregon rather often. At least once every other year we would vacation here, or Cozumel, Mexico. I know both are completely different, but suffice it to say, we loved Oregon more. It just felt like home to us for some reason. We ended up moving to a little town called Walterville. It is quaint, and even today we still live there just on the outskirts. And while this incident scared the bejesus out of us, we still enjoy living on the outskirts of a small rural town backed by forests. It is not that we stopped altogether enjoying the outdoors by any means because of the incident, but we did grow eyes in the back of our heads since then, much like everyone else who has encountered a Bigfoot, I bet. But on with the encounter. Here's exactly what happened when we watched as a Bigfoot, yes, a real-life Bigfoot, snatch up a deer and killed it right in front of us. The trailhead. It was the middle of the week, I remember. It was also about a couple weeks after the new year when we headed out for our second cross-country skiing outing near Kitson Springs, a safe and well-marked trail here in Oregon. We were not experts yet, contrary to anything my husband was thinking in his head at the time. We decided for an early afternoon until dusk trek. We usually take what we need, first aid kit, survival kit, plus a couple of thermal blankets in our packs just in case. Basically everything you need to survive in the winter if you get lost in the forests here in Oregon for at least a few nights or so. My husband also had a concealed weapons permit and carried both times we went out. Up until that experience, we knew there were mountain lions and even people out in the woods to be careful of, so he kept a weapon on him while cross-country skiing. He did pull it out that day, but no shots were fired, of course. We pulled into the trailhead and parked around noon. It was getting dark by 5 p.m. during that particular time of the year here, and we wanted to get at least 4 hours on the trail that day. We got all packed up, took a few sips of hot coffee and a bit of water, used the restrooms that were available, geared up, and took off down the trail. there is a large lake nearby and trail that led to it and alongside it. That would be the trail we would take. Most folks know of the main trail, but there are several we had come to know up there. And northwest to the lake is the direction we would be headed that day. It is a thick forest there, really thick, as is much of the Cascades. And the snowpack was rather deep that year. Fortunately, however, there had been a few other skiers we noticed recently as the trail we were taking was cut with what looked like ski tracks. But there were no other cars in the area when we arrived. We headed off, and for the first 25 minutes and about a mile or so in, we were having a blast. And I have to say I was getting better at this whole sport quickly. Even my husband noticed that. He also noticed a ton of deer and elk track up and down the trail. This was not just a trail for people, it was also a game trail. We ended up near a sort of bend in the trail that would take us southwest of the lake itself. That is when my husband noticed legs sticking up out of the snow. No, not human legs. Deer or elk leg, it seemed. He stopped and decided to take a better look at what it was. Lord knows why, but he did. He took off one ski and dug around with the heel of his ski boot, and after just a few swipes, he noticed the head, well, a partial head. It was gross, disgusting, actually, but morbid curiosity seems to be the part of the male genetic makeup, I suppose. He looked at it with the curiosity, it seemed, to a law enforcement officer who would investigate a crime scene. He whispered something under his breath at first and then said it aloud. "Honey, I think the head has been bitten off. Well, most of it at least." It did look as though it was literally bitten off in one bite, but neither of us was a biologist or worked for the National Forest Service, so who knows. Well, I'll tell you what. We know now, and would in about 45 minutes, that there is something big enough in the woods that can do just that, bite the head off of something in one big bite. My husband was unsure of his one-bite theory. Of course, he did look around for other tracks for a moment or so until everything seemed pretty safe. We did not want to continue if the animal had recently been killed, but it did not seem to be all that recent, we could tell. Especially my husband, who has been a hunter all of his life. Silence is golden. We continued on our way and were just south of the lake. Not that we could see it with all the white around us plus the hills, but we knew we were near it when we decided to grab some water and take a break for a bit. The wind had picked up, and here and there a small snow flurry would present itself, not to mention all of it flying about from the trees themselves carried by the wind. But we stayed relatively warm and comfortable. We opted for a small little knoll above a clearing to park it and have something to snack on, plus some hot coffee, like I'm doing right now. It was, and most likely still is, a beautiful place today, especially in the winter when everything is white and green. The clearing, I suppose, was more like a small meadow, I guess I would call it, in the springtime. I'm sure it is just as beautiful, but we are winter-loving folks. It took a few minutes there before my husband finally realized how quiet it was. Yes, forests here in Oregon, for the most part, are rather quiet during the day and night. It's not like it was springtime, after all. But that day, at that moment, it was dead quiet. Only the wind could be heard through the trees. Now, our sighting did not last long. The sounds and what we experienced before the attack lasted longer, but we did get a good look at this thing and what it can do in a matter of seconds to a large deer. It started with a buck. It came prancing rather fast into the clearing, and there it stopped. Up till that point, we heard nothing but the wind, which put my husband's nerves on high alert. He kept saying it was far too quiet for a forest, even in the middle of a winter afternoon. It was dark here and there in the trees, of course, but out in the clearing it was still rather bright, even for a cloudy day where snow would fall from time to time. The buck just stood there all of a sudden, as if a frozen wind came along and broadsided the poor thing and froze it in time. My husband at that moment looked at me and told me to keep very still, do not talk, no matter what I would see or hear. I do not know what to think. I did not know what to think, but in the end I listened to him and followed his instructions. He did continue to whisper to me that something was up, that this buck was most likely being hunted, or, well, at least spooked by something, and it was not us. It was dead quiet still as we watched this buck not move a single inch. The only movement of this thing was its head and ears. It was constantly, and it looked like nervously, moving its ears around as well as its head. I finally started to realize what he was seeing and feeling. It was as if there was some impending doom in the air, as if something wild and dangerous was about to show itself. You could just get a sense that this buck was sensing it, and its only hope was to be still and not move a muscle, at least not yet. I was nervous all of a sudden, and a little scared. My husband was wide-eyed and looking as nervous as I was, I could tell. Then, from the side of the clearing in our position, we heard a kind of whooping sound. Whoop, whoop. The deer seemed to be rattled and looked like it was going to bolt, but just before it did, we heard another noise from the opposite direction. A knock like wood on wood. Today we know what was going on, but at the time you have no reference for it without being people. Nothing herds its prey like that around here but people. And even then, as my husband would tell me later, people do not hunt like that today in the Pacific Northwest. Maybe Native Americans do from time to time, still practice that, but not your typical hunter. Besides, hunting season for the buck was over. Snap, crackle, pop, and I do not mean Rice Krispies. There was 2 Bigfoot present we could gather later. One to the east and one to the west, and maybe, although we did not hear or see anything for sure, there might have been one to the north of us in the clearing. The reason we believe that was that my husband thought the buck knew we were on the hillside to the south, and it never once bolted north of the clearing. Although we never noticed anything from that direction, maybe it did from down there. I guess in a way we helped that Bigfoot hunt. Another whoop, whoop, I remember, but now the buck was moving in circles as if it knew it was trapped. You could tell this thing knew it was in some big trouble. I wish I could have let it know it was in no trouble from us, but that was the animal lover in me, and impossible at that moment. My husband looked over at me as if worried all of a sudden. He reached down, unlatched the strap on his holstered gun, and whispered to me not to move a muscle again, and to be extremely quiet. I can't tell you what it's like to see such carnage, and the monster that can cause such carnage and not yell, scream, and run all at the same time. But before it was over, I'd be in tears of fear. It came crashing from the left of the clearing, and it was like a massive blur of brown and red. The deer tried to take off. It even made one good leap to get out of the way, but it did not make it. As I said, this was a short experience, as this large creature came out of the woods and knocked the buck down first using its own body. It ran over it, I guess you could say. My husband grabbed my hand and squeezed. It was his way of saying, "Don't scream." I felt like screaming and almost did, but I held back at that moment. My husband's hands were shaking as much as mine, so that, and I noticed he had his gun in the other hand at the ready. We watched as the buck tried to scramble back to its legs, but as it did, this massive, and I mean at least 8-foot beast of a thing, took hold of its antlers with its hands and twisted the head almost completely off. Like the snap, crackle, and pop of Rice Krispies, we could hear the neck snap and pop. The next thing we know, that Bigfoot knelt down quicker than snot and bit into the head of this deer. The snow was suddenly covered in blood, and one of the antlers was now in the hand of a Bigfoot. My husband kept whispering the words "Sasquatch" over and over, but just loud enough for only me to hear. Sasquatch, Sasquatch. We heard a tree knock again to the west, and that is when this Bigfoot picked up and started dragging the buck off by a leg, leaving a nasty trail of blood behind. My husband sat back for a moment and said that he thinks there are more around and that we ought to sit still for a few minutes before moving. I can't tell you how frightened I was just sitting there wondering what in the world just happened. This large creature, covered in hair with arms that seemed as long as my body, came crashing out of the woods and took down a large buck with its bare hands right in front of us. The color was brown, not a real dark brown, maybe even a touch of reddish brown to it, looking back now. At first it moved on all fours. That is why my mind thought bear for a split second there. But this thing stood up on two legs, and the front legs were not legs. They were large muscular arms that tore that poor deer apart in a split second. I was white-faced, my husband said, and maybe even in a little shock, he thought at the time. So after about 2 minutes, he grabbed my hand, and we grabbed our packs and left, heading back the way we came in, back to the trailhead and our car. It was time to go home. Fishing is better. It seemed like the longest drive back home, although we did not live all that far from the area, but it still felt that way. I do believe I did suffer a little shock and a bit of trauma that day. It took me a month before the crazy and scary dream stopped. My husband, a veteran, fared better than me, but he did help me through it all. I am not afraid of the woods by any means, and neither is he. But as I said, we have eyes in the back of our heads when out and about in the wilderness today. No, I did not go back to cross-country skiing, but we did take up fishing instead. It was not the fear of Bigfoot that stopped us from continuing the hobby. It was the fact that Bigfoot do roam the woods here. And being caught out in the woods with something that powerful and fast, well, makes you think twice in traveling too far off the beaten path here, especially while cross-country skiing. But that is our story, Dave, believe it or not. Thanks, Carol.